Well, good afternoon or evening, everyone. It's afternoon for some of our folks watching. It's early evening here in Maine. Hope all of you and your loved ones are healthy and well. My name is John Diamond. I'm the president and CEO of the University of Maine Alumni Association. We're so pleased that you're able to join us today for this presentation by university faculty member Derek Michaud on the topic, The Most Wonderful Time of the Year, Religious Holidays in December. We've got great geographic representation among our virtual attendees tonight. I was just going through the list, and we have alums and friends from 25 different states, including on the West Coast. And we have alums ranging from class years of 1944 to 2020. And of course, we have a lot of special guests joining us as well. So thank you all for your interest in this topic. A couple of things before we get started. We're recording this presentation, so just want you to be aware of that. We're going to post it on our website, and it will be available to watch or re-watch on demand at any time. We'll be sending you some information about that along with a survey about tonight's the latest in our webinar series, so that you can give us some feedback on this particular topic, as well as other topics you might like to hear about. We are also, of course, there will be a Q&A session at the end or in the second half of this presentation tonight, and there's a really easy way for you to submit questions. If you would look at the bottom of your screen, there's a little comic strip bubble down at the bottom. That's the chat button. Just click on that, type in your question, and hit the return button. And what will happen is those will be fed to us, and we will present those questions, as many as possible, to Professor Michaud over the course of the second half of the program. So it's a very simple thing to do. Feel free to submit those questions at any point. You don't have to wait until we get to the Q&A section in order to submit those. So let's get started. You're here to hear Professor Michaud. He is an instructor with the philosophy department at the University of Maine. He's an alumnus of the University of Maine, class of 1999. He's originally from Skowhegan, and he teaches about world religions and Judaic studies in particular at the University of Maine within the philosophy program. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Derek, and allow you to get started.
Okay. Well, hello. It's great to see so many folks joining us this evening or afternoon, depending on where you happen to be. It's most definitely evening where I am, because it is quite dark, as our alumni can testify to this time of year at 5 p.m. in Orono. So my talk is on religious holidays in December. And I am, as John introduced, a lecturer in the philosophy department here at UMaine. I'm a coordinator of two academic minors, one in religious studies and one in Judaic studies. There's links here, and I'll be sharing this again at the end of my talk. And perhaps most importantly, I'm a proud alumnus, class of 1999. So it probably goes without saying that there are limitations to what we can possibly talk about this evening, but I'm going to say it anyway. We couldn't possibly talk about all of the religious events that go on in December in an hour or a half hour, or even in multiple hours. Most likely that's the stuff of whole courses. But the big takeaway that I hope you can bring with you after this evening's program is that religion is very complicated. Variation, development, and interpretation are the rule and not the exception when it comes to religion. It depends is usually the best answer I'm going to be able to give to a lot of what I expect will be really excellent questions later on. So before we get into religious observances themselves, a little bit just about the calendar, right? And just what month is this anyway? That sounds like a strange question, but that'll make a little more sense in a moment. The first thing to mention is that December, this time of year, is not really the most important time of the year for most religions. Most religious traditions have their most significant observances in either the spring or the fall, in time with sort of natural cycles of rebirth, growth, and then harvest into the fall. So, for example, in Judaism, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, comes in the fall. It's the most holy day in the Jewish year. And the Feast of the Resurrection, Christian Easter, is the most holy day for Christians, and that happens in the springtime. So there's a bit of a question here about, well, just why are we paying attention, other than it being December, to December, right? And why is this the most wonderful time of year? Well, I promise not to dwell on this too much because it actually gets mathematical, and that's someone else's department here at UMaine. But it helps to know a little bit about calendars to understand what's going to come a bit later on tonight. So some calendars are lunar, that is, they're based on the cycles of the moon. And other calendars are solar. Now, the calendar that most of us use most of the time, the kind of secular calendar that the United States government uses, that sort of thing, is the Gregorian solar calendar. And in that calendar, today is December 16th. But, well, in the Julian, an older solar calendar still used by some Eastern Orthodox Christians and others, today is the second day of December, right? So these calendars matter. Knowing which calendar folks are using is important. You could miss it by, well, 14 days otherwise. So while many Christians will celebrate Christmas on the 25th of this month, some will do so on the 7th of January, right? And this kind of thing comes up in an even more pronounced way when you compare a purely lunar calendar to the Gregorian solar calendar. The Islamic calendar is a pure lunar calendar. That means that any Islamic month can occur during any Gregorian month. They cycle around the entire solar year eventually. It takes a little over 30 years for that to happen, but it happens regularly. And this is why the holy month of Ramadan in the Islamic tradition moves around with respect to the Gregorian calendar, right? So again, which calendar we're paying attention to, which calendar is relevant, is an important thing to know and understand at least a bit about. Fortunately, these days, you can look all of these things up online. There are apps and such that help us sort out all of this stuff. You can imagine centuries ago, this was really difficult to figure out, right? Figuring out when the holidays actually were was pretty tricky business. An example from the Buddhist tradition of what happens when older lunar calendars come into a bit of tension or conflict with sort of the modern dominance of the Gregorian calendar, right? In Japan, Bodhi Day or Rohatsu literally means the 8th day of the 12th month. Well, originally that was the 8th day of the 12th lunar month. But with the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s, this was modernized in Japan to the Gregorian 8th of December, right? So this day celebrating the enlightenment of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, happens in Japan on the 8th of December, just a few days ago, while other Buddhists, other Mahayana Buddhists, will celebrate this same holiday, really, in January, where it traditionally had been. So, all that said, what's special about December? And well, what I have to say here is specifically about December in the Northern Hemisphere, right? So if you're coming to us from Australia or South America, my apologies, we'll have to flip this around, yeah? In December in the Northern Hemisphere, of course, the farther north you go, the darker it is, right? And again, if you're an alum or a current student or of UMaine, or you've lived here for any length of time, you know that it does in fact get pretty dark pretty early. There's not a whole lot of hours of daylight by the time you get to the solstice on the 21st. So my basic thought here, and I share this with lots and lots of folks, lots of scholars of religion, have made this same observation over and over again, that it's probably not at all a coincidence that for folks living in the Northern Hemisphere, around the time of the winter solstice, it's time to have a party, right? I don't know about you, but as it gets darker, it feels right somehow to, you know, turn the lights on, maybe decorate. It's been a while since you've seen much vibrant natural color, right? So we bring out the decorations, and before you know it, maybe even we've decided, like they have in Sweden, to put a bunch of flaming candles on the head of a young girl and give other candles to a bunch of other kids and parade them around, right? This is for Lucia Day in Sweden. An observance that happens on December 13th, which in their old calendar in Sweden was the longest night of the year, right? So as it gets dark, what do? You kindle a flame, right? So why December? Why these holidays in December? A lot of it goes back to, well, where people live in the world and light, or maybe more accurately, the lack thereof, right? Now, this day, we're not sure exactly where this observance in Sweden comes from historically. It's a bit, there's a bit of controversy amongst scholars here. Some think that this is about Saint Lucia of Syracuse. It could be, yeah, Christian saint. It's probably also drawing on even older pre-Christian notions that were already present in Sweden long before Christianity arrived. And that brings me to some of the other ancient celebrations that happen in December. One of the more famous is Yule. And that's a word that we still use. In many contexts today, it's taken as basically a synonym for Christmas time, right? We still use the phrase a lot, but originally Yule is a distinct celebration, has nothing inherently to do with Christianity, and instead prioritizes forms of nature worship and respect, and is still practiced in that sort of form by many who identify today as pagan or neo-pagan, some Wiccans, others with these kinds of spiritualities. These things still exist, but were dominant, especially in Northern Europe, if you go back to many centuries, even a couple thousand years ago. In ancient Rome, there were a couple of celebrations that are worth mentioning that happened typically in December, as we understand that month today. One of these is known as Saturnalia. And the picture on the left shows the ruins of the temple of Saturn, the Roman god Saturn. It's the one with all the columns on the right of that picture. So for Saturnalia, ancient Romans would feast and drink, and there were rituals of role reversal where masters would serve their servants or slaves, and vice versa. Everything goes topsy-turvy for a while, as is often the case in festivals, traditional festivals. There was the giving of gifts and gambling and feasting and drinking, right? Are you getting the idea? It's a big party, right? Including sacrifices to Saturn and a public banquet, right? So they would sacrifice the animal, cook it, and eat it, have a big party. There was also a special kind of hat that people wore that normally was reserved for certain members of society, but during Saturnalia, everyone could wear them. And there were even, and this gets a little bloody by modern standards, but there were gladiatorial offerings, right? Sort of sacrifices of the losers, basically, in gladiatorial combat. Most likely, actually, what was being offered up to the god is the bravery and skill of the winner here, and not exactly the body of the loser. But anyway, either way, people did die, at least on occasion, in these contests. And another observance arose or was revived. Again, there's some controversy here amongst the scholars on this, on the details, but the Emperor Aurelian made the cult of the unconquered sun, or Sol Invictus, one of the official religions of the Roman Empire in the year 274 of the Common Era, what we used to call AD, the period of time we're currently in the Gregorian calendar. And this was enacted by the emperor on December 25th. And by the 4th century, we have records of folks celebrating the nativity of this deity, Sol Invictus, on December 25th. Now, you don't have to be a religious studies scholar or a historian to wonder, hey, wait a minute, that sounds familiar. I wonder if that had any influence on Christmas. And since the 12th century, actually, since the Middle Ages, people have argued that it probably did. The historical evidence here is surprisingly thin, but it probably did play a role in the deciding of just when to celebrate Christmas, right? So it's one of the kind of borrowings from one religious tradition into another that's going to come up again and again in the rest of my talk this evening. Another observance from ancient times that's still with us, unlike these ancient Roman ones, which are for the most part extinct now, the death of the prophet Zoroaster is celebrated on December 26th. Not celebrated, it's marked, it's remembered on December 26th. This is an important day in what is known today, by scholars at least, as Zoroastrianism. This is the ancient religion of Persia. By the way, the Magi, the wise men associated with visiting the young Jesus and the holiday of Epiphany in the Christian calendar, their Magi are members of this Zoroastrian tradition, right? So they're Persian wise men. So these are some of the ancient observances, some of which still exist, some have had parts of them adapted and adopted by other later religious traditions. Let's focus in a bit on two of the most popular, common religious holidays that happen to fall usually in December. The first of these is Hanukkah. Now, the word itself, Hanukkah, comes from roots that mean dedication, as in dedicating a place or thing to a certain end or purpose, right? In this case, the dedication or the rededication, rather, of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. We'll come to that in a moment. But one of the things that comes up often when people talk about Hanukkah is, well, how do you spell it, right? And there are a number of ways to spell Hanukkah. Which one's right? Well, within reason, they all are, and none of them are. Why do I say that? Because, well, the word itself comes from a language, Hebrew, that has its own characters, right? So the actual word appears on your screen on the left. So what we find in all of these different spellings of Hanukkah are different attempts to transliterate, to represent with Latin characters for non-Hebrew readers what this word sounds like. Yeah? And this is why you get a bunch of different spellings. The same thing happens, by the way, with a lot of words from East Asia, Chinese words. This comes up in religious studies often when people say, well, wait a minute, in one place I saw Tao spelled with a D, and then here I saw Tao and it's spelled with a T. Well, same thing, right? Actually, the word isn't spelled with either a D or a T, right? Those are just attempts to convey what the word sounds like. Yeah? So however you spell it, we're talking about Hanukkah. So a bit of historical context here. First thing to know is that we're talking about a long time ago, right? Well over 2,000 years ago, the time of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. One of the objects in this temple was the menorah, the menorah. Menorah is just a word that means candelabra, really, or that sort of thing. But when we talk about the menorah, we mean this one with 7 lamps that was in the temple in Jerusalem. Now, over time, as often happens when you're situated at the conjunction of continents, the way the land of Israel is, the Greek Seleucid Empire moved in, took over, yeah, and there broke out amongst these ancient Jewish kingdom a kind of conflict between Hellenism, between Greek culture, Greek ways of thinking, Greek philosophy, and fashions, and food, and you name it, and traditional Jewish beliefs and practices. And some sought sort of accommodation with the Seleucids who were in charge effectively and adopted some Greek ways, while others resisted. Now, that kind of sets us up for the story, right? The basic story of Hanukkah. So, Antiochus IV was the Seleucid emperor, and he's a pretty bold guy. He's a pretty bold character, and he's the bad guy in the story of Hanukkah, the ultimate bad guy, right? Sort of like the emperor in Star Wars or something like that. Except this guy is real. He named himself Epiphanes, which means God manifest, right? So he thinks pretty highly of himself here, right? He's not just the emperor, he's not just Basileus, a king of his empire, he's also divine, right? And in about the year 167 BCE, what we used to call BC, it's the same thing, really. BCE just means before the Common Era. BC means before Christ. So out of deference for the fact that most human beings on Earth don't particularly have any reason to date things by the birth of Christ, in scholarship today we use BCE. The years are exactly the same, though. So in about 167, this emperor orders the desecration of the temple in Jerusalem. The temple is looted. Many of the temple objects, vessels, and things are taken. They're destroyed. They're misused. A statue of the Greek god Zeus is erected, and there are even sacrifices offered to Zeus of pigs. Now, if you know anything at all about Judaism, you know that, well, pigs and pork is not at all kosher, right? Literally. This is a big time desecration of the temple. And in effect, from the Jewish perspective at least, what the emperor was doing here is basically banning Judaism as it was practiced at the time. And by the way, this is on your screen here is a coin from this particular emperor. There he is seated in sort of divine splendor on his throne and all that. Yeah. So this story is found not in the Hebrew Bible, by the way, not in the canonized Hebrew Bible, but instead in some apocryphal texts that are included in some Christian Bibles, but not the Jewish Bible. The first and second Maccabees. There's also references to this story in Josephus, who's a first century historian, and much of what we know about the story and the celebration of Hanukkah comes from the Mishnah and the Talmud, some rabbinic works from later in the Common Era. So things are looking bad for our heroes in the Holy Land when Mattathias and sons lead a rebellion, right? A courageous rebellion against the evil empire. And eventually, through great struggle, sacrifice, heroism, Judah Maccabee. And Maccabee comes from a word meaning hammer, right? So he's Judah the Hammer, which is one of the great names in the history of the world, I think. Succeeded in fighting back against this empire. And this, roughly speaking, begins the period of the Hasmonean kingdom of Judea, right? Of the free kingdom of Judea, from about the year 140 BCE to 37, when Herod the Great is installed by the Roman Empire as a kind of puppet ruler in the region. So what's this got to do with Hanukkah in particular, right? Great story. It would make, fantastic story, right? What's it got to do with the holiday? Well, one of the things that Judah and the other Maccabees do after they win the battle, after they win the war, is they restore, they clean, and they rededicate the temple. And this is where we get the story of the miracle of the oil. Now, they're looking in the temple for undefiled oil that can be used to light the menorah, and they only find enough oil set aside, especially by the high priest from before, to last for one day. But it lasts instead for 8. Thus, the 8 days of Hanukkah. Lest they be forgotten, a couple of other figures that are really big in many people's modern tellings of the tale. 2 women, 2 heroines, yeah, Judith, who's exploits are depicted in the Book of Judith. In that story, she stops a siege of Jerusalem by, she's very beautiful. She basically seduces this military leader into coming over. She feeds him a bunch of salty cheese that makes him really thirsty. And then she just keeps the wine flowing into him until he's so drunk that she can decapitate him. Again, fantastic story of heroism and fighting back against the empire. Right? In the second book of Maccabees, there's a story about an unnamed mother who is martyred after her 7 sons, each of them because they refuse to eat pork. Right? These Greek Seleucids are trying to force these Jews to eat pork, and she and her sons won't do it. Yeah, she's known today as either Hannah or Miriam or Solomonia. Goes by a bunch of different names. She's unnamed actually in the text, but I like to think of her as Hannah. So Judith and Hannah, right? Two heroines of this resistance to the empire. Yeah, all part of the story. So things are restored. We've got a free kingdom in Judea again. And well, then come the Romans, yeah, as happened for pretty much everyone around the Mediterranean at some point in history. And the history here is more complicated than we could possibly get into this evening, but in the year 70 of the Common Era, the Romans sack the city of Jerusalem. They destroyed the Second Temple and marched off with all of the temple instruments, temple goods to Rome. And you can see this even today on a relief on the side of the Arch of Titus in Rome. And if you look close there, you can see the menorah, right? The seven light menorah from the temple carted off to Rome as a kind of spoil of war, and also to dishearten and dispirit the people. Now, with the destruction of the temple, the Jewish religion and broader just social customs and the like had to be rethought for life both without the temple and outside of Israel. And this work was taken up by the early rabbis, and it gets codified in a few different types of text. The earliest of these is known as the Mishnah, incorporates the rabbinic tradition, right? The oral Torah, right? The unwritten laws. They finally get written down so that they can be studied and compared and worked with in about the year 200 of the Common Era. And then by the year 600, we get the appearance of what's known as the Talmud. There's actually 2 Talmuds, a Jerusalem one and a Babylonian one. The Talmud is basically a continuance of the kind of ongoing conversation and debate and interpretation and reinterpretation of both biblical law, Torah, and the oral tradition. So to this day, rabbinic study has everything to do very often with Talmud. Yeah. So why do I mention that? Well, I mention that because Hanukkah doesn't occur in the Bible. So it's nearly unique. Purim is also like this, not a biblically enacted holiday either. Both of these holidays were enacted by the tradition, by the rabbis themselves. And in the tradition, there are 2 mitzvot, right? Commandments, observances that are prescribed for Hanukkah traditionally. One of them is the most famous, and that involves the lighting of the lamps or candles, more often these days, of the Hanukkah menorah, or the Hanukkah. Yeah, 8 lamps altogether, and 1 helper, the shamash, in the middle, for a total of 9 across the whole structure, and lit progressively with blessings over 8 nights until all are lit on the final night. This, by the way, this is the way that Hillel said that it should be done. He won out in debate, as was so often the case with Shammai, another one of the early rabbis. In addition to the lighting of the menorah, which many folks are familiar with, there's also the recitation of Psalms 113 to 118. Beyond that, there's not a whole lot that's really directed or is supposed to be done, or anything like that traditionally, but there are a lot of popular observances, right? And one of these is, well, playing with a dreidel. Yeah, this is a 4-sided top game, the rules of which vary a bit from place to place and from time to time, but the dreidel itself, we now know, developed out of a popular, very similar game from the British Isles that was popular during the Christmas season. So it was being played by Christian kids, one imagines, and was eventually picked up by Jewish folks as well, when it was moved into, or was brought over into German-speaking lands. The teetotum in the British Isles becomes Trendel in German, and then Dreidel in Yiddish. So again, a bit of borrowing, right? This time in an unexpected direction from Christianity to Judaism, whereas so much of Christian thought is a kind of borrowing or corrupting, depending on your perspective, of Jewish ideas and texts and traditions. And then there's the food, yeah? Food especially fried in oil, yeah. Latkes, jelly donuts, yeah, are you hungry yet? This is the giving of gifts, although the giving of gifts has become much more important in, especially North America, under the influence of Christmas. Yeah, all the Christian kids are getting gifts, so yeah. Traditionally, also the giving of gelt. You may know gelt as those little chocolate coins. Originally, actual just coins, yeah, and still in some contexts, still gifts of money. We think that this probably started with the as a way to pay one's teacher around this time of year. So as a teacher, I have a kind of a soft spot for that. Plus, you know, the chocolate ones that folks often use today, I'm all for those too. So all of these observances happen either privately at home or in communal gatherings, could be in either context, right? One of the important things about Hanukkah, especially in the diaspora outside of Israel and in Europe and elsewhere, is that it's one of the more public-facing holidays, right? In fact, the whole idea of lighting the Hanukkah menorah is to show the world, right? Is to make a statement. And you find no better expression of this, I think, than in this photograph from 1932. The bravery of the family that did this is just staggering to me. So Rachel Posner was the wife of Rabbi Dr. Posner, and she took this photograph of the family menorah in the window facing a Nazi flag, just in the early days of the rise of the Nazis in Germany. And she wrote on the back of this photograph, in German originally, but I'll give it to you in English here, Hanukkah 5692, or what we would call in the Gregorian calendar, 1932. Quote, "Death to Judah, so the flag says. Judah will live forever, so the light answers. And to me, at some risk of reducing an entire multifaceted tradition to, well, the aftermath now of the Holocaust, to me, this is the meaning of Hanukkah. Yeah, as an outsider, resistance, persistence, existence. Yeah, and light overcoming darkness. Right. That's what Hanukkah is all about. I think, or at least that's part of what Hanukkah is all about, right? What it's really about is up to everyone who observes it to decide for themselves. And then, of course, there is Christmas, right? In the Gregorian calendar, starting on December 25th, Christmas is actually a season. It goes for 12 days. That 12 days of Christmas song is not just a clever song, that's real. The nativity stories, probably familiar because of the cultural, social dominance of Christianity. I'm sure you know the story pretty well. Mary and Joseph are engaged. She becomes pregnant by the Holy Spirit. Joseph is told to marry Mary anyway. They give birth, she gives birth rather, and they name him Jesus. And then many of the kind of classic elements of the story actually show up in the Gospel according to Luke, where there's the bit about the journey to Bethlehem, the birth and the manger, and angels and shepherds, and all of that stuff that we see so much in Christian art, and, Christmas cards, and you name it this time of year. Now, not to burst anyone's bubble here, but the birth of Jesus from a scholarly perspective really has nothing at all to do with a barn or a stable. That's actually the result of a mistranslation and a misunderstanding of the way folks lived in first century Palestine in the Middle East. So the story, as it's been traditionally told, is that there's no room for them in the inn, right? Like a hotel in Bethlehem when they arrive. Well, the word translated inn is actually kataluma. And that doesn't mean in this context at all, right? It's literally just the other room, right? As in the guest room or the room that we do the fancy stuff in, right? Like the reception room, something like that. So what the story is actually telling us in the original Greek is that that room was already occupied. And that makes sense if families all had to go to their ancestral homes to be counted for the census, then, well, you would expect that, well, those members of the family who were already living there in Bethlehem, they're going to have a full house, right? And in the culture of the time, nobody's going to get turned away at the door entirely, right? So where do they go? Well, they go into the family room, right? Essentially the ancient equivalent of the living room. And in those days, it was common to have mangers, right? Those things used to feed livestock in that main room of the house. So while this gets imagined in later Christian art and tradition as a birth in a stable or a barn or something like that, it's really more like birth in the living room because the spare bedroom was occupied, or something like that, in our kind of modern terms, and maybe instead of being laid in a manger, maybe think of the modern equivalent of being using the dog bed in the living room for the baby, something like that, perhaps, right? People lived really close with their livestock in those days, the way we do now with, say, dogs and cats. So anyway, now that I've burst that bubble, where do we get this idea that that this all happens in a barn? Well, it has everything to do with, as I said, misunderstanding the Greek and first century culture in the Middle East, and St. Francis of Assisi, right? The medieval Italian saint who popularized making these little models of the Nativity. right? The first one he did was live, and it had like actors playing the roles and stuff. And it was a way to teach people the story in a day when most folks couldn't read. But pretty quickly, folks started to make these little things, and I grew up with them. I love them, not as much as my mother does, but anyway. And they've become now just part of the story, but they're of course just not in the original text at all, right? Remember what I said about religion being complicated, involving interpretation, right, on top of interpretation. So for time, I'm gonna gloss over some of this, and maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A if folks want to. Um, the the Christian community didn't observe Christmas in the very beginning. It took a long time, actually. It took centuries for Christmas to catch on as a holiday. And this is probably for a bunch of complicated theological reasons that if folks want to go into them, we can. Christmas as a short season of 12 days is distinct from traditionally Advent, the period of preparation for Christmas, right? In modern America, we kind of moosh them all together into the Christmas season. But traditionally for Christians, they're distinct, yeah? Christmas doesn't end on the 25th, it starts on the 25th. And how is the Feast of the Nativity celebrated? Well, it's celebrated with Christmas Eve vigils, with midnight masses, like this one here from St. Peter's in Rome. Christmas morning services, often in church as well. Big feasts, dinners, that sort of thing. Singing carols and hymns, gifts, of course, and rocking around the Christmas tree, obviously. Epiphany also gets conflated often in our Christmas cards and the like with Christmas itself, but this is another short season that comes in January, right? The wise men aren't there for the birth, despite what many of those nativity sets depict, right? And of course, we could talk endlessly really about all of the popular Christmas celebrations, right? The Christmas tree, and how that's almost certainly from ancient pagan European traditions around bringing evergreen boughs into the house and the like. And we could talk forever about how a heretic punching bishop from Turkey became a magical fat man who lives at the North Pole, right? Santa Claus has a wonderful story to him, both historically and culturally. But I hope you get the idea that that because of these kind of festivals highlighting light and a party and celebrating the rebirth of well, literally the light, yeah, the return of the sun after the winter solstice, right? The days start to get longer, right? Hope is kindled in the darkness, and that makes it perhaps the most wonderful time of the year. A song, by the way, written by, it's my last borrowing of the evening, two American Jews, to capture the spirit of a holiday celebrated by Christians in honor of the birth of a Jew, Jesus. So, yeah, whew, that was a bit of a mad dash at the end there, but yeah, I think that'll do it. So I look forward to your questions.
That's great, and
yeah, I can stop sharing this if we want to actually see each other. That's probably not a bad idea.
that wonderful presentation. And just a reminder to everybody, if you do want to pose a question, just go to the chat button on the bottom of your screen and click on that, type in your question, and those will be provided to Professor Michaud, and we'll get to them. We've got a few questions that we'll get started with. One of our viewers today asked if you have a conclusion for the variations in the transliteration of Hanukkah. Which one does your scholarship support of the various options that you shared?
Yeah, wow, yeah, good question. The the consensus seems to have settled on, well, two of them. Yeah, remember what I said about, like, I'm going to consistently be trying to, like, just punt, really, and say, like, no, really, it depends who you talk to, right? So some folks think that the spellings that start with ch are the more traditional, the more and therefore more authentic. The most commonly used today amongst English speakers is the spelling that I used in the presentation, right? So HANUCUKKAH, right? That's the one that you're going to see most often. It shows up in many style guides now for journalists and that sort of thing, right? So it's that's the one that seems to be winning out. But again, you'll see all of the ones that I shared and even a few more, right? At last count, I stopped even looking after, like, I don't know, 4 dozen different ways to spell the word. Yeah, okay, you get the idea, right? There are a number of different ways to do it. Yeah.
Is there a difference between the way it's spelled in other English-speaking countries from what we're accustomed to here in the United States?
Not necessarily. No. Again, because what's going on here is transliteration, right? And it's really, it's down to everyone's best guess as to how to present the word in a way that will make an English speaker say it at least approximately correctly, right? You find a similar thing with the former dictator of Libya, right? Muammar Gaddafi. There were something like a half dozen at least different ways to spell Gaddafi in the newspaper, right, or on the news. Which of those is correct? Well, none of them really, because his name is actually spelled in Arabic, right? They're all just attempts to get the rest of us to say something close to what a native speaker would say. So, yeah.
Another question is, when you were discussing the nativity scene, or particularly the birth of Christ, and the understanding that the common understanding that he was born in a manger, in a barn, outside the inn. When you're teaching that in your classes, even for your students who have grown up with a rich religious tradition, I suspect that comes as a surprise.
Yeah, well, yeah. When teaching religious studies, that kind of experience is pretty common, right? Yeah, and some of that has to do again with the amount of variation that there is in the expressions of all of these traditions, right? And I yeah, it can be a bit tricky to navigate. I have yet to have anyone really just reject the idea that, like, well, no, that's just not what the Greek says or something like that. But part of how I try to handle that in the most respectful way I can is to say that look, just because our traditions and our symbols and our ways of understanding them have a history, it doesn't make them any less, it doesn't necessarily make them any less valuable or meaningful to us, right? Like I said, I grew up with one of those nativity sets like that, right? That even has the three wise men in it, right? As if birth and then Epiphany happens the next moment, and it all happens at once. Well, that's not actually what you find written in the text of the Bible. It's not the way traditionally Christians have celebrated these holidays, right? They space them out. There's time in between these occasions for a reason, right? But is that object reminiscent of all kinds of great times with family and loved ones, and right? Yeah, right. Yeah. It comes from my grandparents. right? So it's very meaningful, even though, like, is it an accurate portrayal of history? Not even close, right? I mean, many of those things, I mean, they look like basically medieval Italian barns, right? Well, even if we're talking about a barn in the Middle East, it didn't look like that. Right? Like, I mean, the architecture itself is off even. So yeah, and yet it can be deeply meaningful, right? I mean, many folks would take extra meaning from the idea of of a divine figure choosing to be born in some place as humble as a stable, right?
Mhm.
So if you take seriously the idea, of the divine preexistence of this baby, right? This is not just a baby in the traditional Christian perspective. Then, well, that adds another layer to just how powerful it is that the idea that God would send God's own Son into the world for the benefit of human beings, right? And in going back to my metaphor of light, right? The sort of kindling this flame of new hope in the darkness, bringing, in this case, Christian salvation into the world, right? I mean, so if these symbols work that way, and I think they do for many folks, then that's great, right? Yeah, but that doesn't mean that they're not symbols with a past.
Can you elaborate on the history of Christmas as a celebration of Christ's birth? You mentioned earlier that it didn't. Obviously, it took, I don't know how many years before that became an
Yeah,
established tradition and
yeah,
celebration.
yeah. In the early centuries, um, the things that were most important for the early Christian communities were the teaching, right, and especially the events of the end of Christ's life, right? So his death on the cross, um, and how that's not the end of the story that Christians tell, right? So it's Easter above all, yeah. It's the resurrection that's the big celebration, yeah, and that really is the anchor of the Christian calendar, yeah. So much so that in those days, many Christians were, of course, were converting, right? When it was a new tradition, it wasn't like it is now, where most Christians are just born into it, really, at least to begin with. Um, well, it had to get going first before that could happen, right? And so part of that process of being brought into the community involved, well, learning about this new faith, right? Learning the stories, learning the rituals, learning the prayers, and all of this kind of stuff. And it was around the calendar related to the celebration of Easter that they would be baptized and fully admitted into the Christian community, right? So like the whole life of early Christianity is about really the other end of the life cycle, as it were, right? Of the man Jesus of Nazareth. Um, Over time, this becomes it becomes more and more important for theological reasons to celebrate the fact that, well, like the rest of us, this man, while also divine, had a birth, right? Um, One of the things that the sort of theologically the development of Christmas as a celebration is about is a way of emphasizing how it's not a mere appearance, right? It's not like God shows up and just looks like a man for a while, right? Like, no, the idea is that God actually became a man, right? And oh, by the way, was born in a particular time and place, right? During the time of Emperor Augustus, and right in this city, and yeah, right. So that's part of the driving force here. As the theologians start to really formulate a robust sort of sense of the incarnation, right, and this kind of dual aspect of Christ as both divine and human, and trying to hold them together. Christmas as really the feast of the incarnation, yeah, or a feast of the incarnation, becomes much more important over time. But in the early days, many folks actually thought that it was a bad idea to celebrate birthdays for anyone, including Jesus, because, well, the pagan Romans did that, right? Like they knew that Sol Invictus had a birthday that just so happens to be on December 25th, and to set themselves distinct from that, right? In part, in the beginning, they said, like, no, we don't do that. We don't do birthdays, right? Because what really matters is not that first birth in the earthly realm, right? But our second birth, yeah, our resurrection into eternal life that is to come, right? That's what really matters. Yeah. As the end of the world didn't come in those as the centuries went by, things get reconsidered and reinterpreted, right? And Christmas starts to become much more important.
How about Hanukkah? When was Hanukkah first celebrated?
Yeah, well, depending on how you interpret this, you could say that the first Hanukkah happens in the year 163-ish, before the Common Era, right? When the Maccabees restore the temple in Jerusalem, right? When it becomes the kind of more high profile, at least outside of Judaism, high profile holiday, right? Really comes much later, and it has everything to do with the influence of the kind of all pervasive influence of Christmas, right? And this has led to generations now of folks profoundly misunderstanding Hanukkah as sort of Jewish Christmas, or the Jewish answer to Christmas, or something like this, which is entirely wrong. I mean, that's simply ridiculous, right? Like, it has nothing at all to do with Jesus at all, right? In fact, Jesus probably would have celebrated Hanukkah himself, right? Like, he would have known it as one of the more minor but still there occasions in the Jewish calendar. So becoming an occasion for, say, gifts for kids, for not just one day of presents, but 8, right? This kind of stuff, this kind of modern thing, doesn't really take off until you get the sort of modern commercialization of Christmas, and then quickly on its heels comes Hanukkah too, right? Because who doesn't like presents? Who doesn't like a bigger party? Who doesn't, right? Yeah, why not? Yeah.
Let's wrap up with a question about Santa Claus. You mentioned how Santa Claus evolved, the tradition and the roots of that. Could you quickly kind of take us from the great gift giver?
Yeah. Again, and sorry for this, but this is how it goes, right? There's part of the problem is that this character Santa Claus has influences from a bunch of different traditions, right? From all over the world, really, at this point. Yeah. But Saint Nicholas was actually a late 3rd, early 4th century bishop who was known actually for giving gifts. Like that part comes through. Like he did that. There are stories about Saint Nicholas giving gifts, but in ancient times he was best known for being a really strong defender of the new Christian orthodoxy against a certain kind of heretic who thought that Jesus was not fully divine, was less than fully God, right? And the story goes that that St. Nicholas actually just took a swipe at one of the leading proponents of this, Arius, at a church council of all things, right? So surrounded by other bishops and theologians and that sort of thing, right? All this clergy gets together to sort of figure out, okay, well, what do we believe? Fight breaks out, and there's St. Nicholas taking a swing at him, right? And this is remembered today as Nicholas as the great defender of Christian orthodoxy, right? But you can tell that doesn't sound very much like something that Santa Claus would do to me, right? Yeah, it sounds a little aggressive for Santa. So
like the movie Bad Santa.
yeah, bad Santa. Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Well,
Yeah, being a
Professor,
theologian back then was a dangerous profession. There were lots of fist fights, it turns out, but yeah.
well, we unfortunately have run out of time, but Professor Derek Michaud, thank you so much for your presentation. It was wonderful and very enlightening.
Right.
And to everybody who, thank you all for joining us. We'll be resuming our bi-monthly webinar series, and we'll be updating you on what the schedule will be for January and beyond. But just a reminder that this we did record tonight, and it will be available on the Alumni Association's website. You'll be getting an email with the information both about Professor Michaud's programs at the university, as well as the opportunity to share this recording with others if you'd like, or to rewatch it again. So we wish you all a wonderful December, no matter what your religious traditions are or spiritual beliefs are. Best wishes for a warm and healthy December and New Year. Again, thank you all.
And thank you. This was great.